Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I would say that one of my colleagues at the Jordan Institute is a Northeastern graduate from 1978, and just a wonderful guy. And I think what you're doing here at the university is just fabulous, and I'd like to see more people getting into this field. So I start with this slide because this building is a nice masonry building. It's quite durable, has a zero carbon footprint, and does anybody know how old it is? 2,200 years. Yeah, that's close, that's right. About 2,000 years old, and needs a little repair, but all things being equal, it's held up very well. And the point here is, if we think about our buildings from a durability standpoint, we really should be building buildings for 400 or 500 years, not for 40. So what I'm going to try to do today is, how can we have an impact on climate change? Can everybody hear me okay? I'm not sure whether I'm doubling up. There's no feedback? It's okay? Okay, good. So how can we slow down climate change? What does it currently look like? And where are we using energy, and how much of it are we wasting? This is what I think is going to be somewhat surprising. And where should we focus? And I believe we should do this in the fields of demand reduction, and then looking at hot water district energy systems. My thesis is that we really don't have an energy supply problem. We just have a massive energy waste problem. And unlike the previous 150 years, we can't fuel switch our way out of this problem. When we were on wood, we fuel switched to coal, and then from coal we fuel switched to oil, and then from oil we fuel switched to natural gas, and then there was an attempt in there to switch to nuclear. And in each case, the new source of fuel, there was enough of it to meet the demand. But as we move to renewables, we're going to find that we don't have that volume of energy, so that we really need to cut our demand before we switch to renewables. So this is a slide that Jim Hansen put together that I really think makes a wonderful case for climate change. If you look at this slide, from 1951 to 1980, you had a relatively straightforward distribution. 33% in the blue was below normal temperatures, 33% were average temperatures, and 33% were above average temperatures. This was in North America. Here's what it looked like from 2001 to 2011. Almost 76% of temperatures were above normal. And so we're seeing this whole thing shift to the right. And 2012, as many of you know, was the hottest year on record in North America. We had 34,000 unusually hotter records set, and 6,000 unusually cooler records set in the US. So what is global weirding, as Andy Levin's called it, looks like? Does anybody know where this picture is taken? This happened about a year ago, June. What? England? No.
United States. Midwest.
United States, yep. Not the Midwest. It is the Midwest. Texas, right, exactly. This is in West Texas, and what is it?
It's hail that accumulated, and then when there was a melt, there was a gigantic river going through the stacked up couple of feet of hail.
Exactly. 4 feet of hail fell on this site in a 24-hour period. And you can see the grass in the lower corner over there. This was just a pasture. So these kinds of unusual storm events are what we're seeing in many, many different ways. So this is what's called the Sankey chart, and I find this very useful, and you can study these for hours, or I could. But on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is the primary sources of fuel, and on the right-hand side in the gray box is the actual amount of energy that made it into service, and then the light gray box in the upper right-hand corner what was wasted. So for the country in 2008, when we were sort of at the top of our economic boom, we were wasting about 57.5% of all the primary energy we were using. If we go to 2011, which is the most recent, we've improved a little tiny bit. We're using 2 quads left. The quad is a quadrillion BTUs, it's a big number. And we're still wasting 57.1%.
Does everybody understand? Oh, they're in this line.
Yeah.
Do you all understand this chart? Dick could spend days on this chart,
Okay.
but we don't want him to. But okay, so you're talking about primary energy inputs: coal, oil, gas, all the major fuels that drive the economy on the left-hand side of the chart, right?
Yeah.
And then they all get moved around and moved through power plants and through whatever to produce, ultimately, on the right-hand side of the chart, what we want is useful work.
Right.
And the key here is that we all want cold beer, warm houses, night baseball, and it takes a certain amount of energy to produce that. We actually don't care. You and I don't know how many gallons of oil it costs to keep the beer, uses to keep the beer cold. We just want the cold beer. And Dick's chart is trying to show you how much of the energy actually gets consumed before it even arrives at your refrigerator.
And we'll get into that in details in a minute. But here we are in 2009, which was sort of the depths of the most recent recession, and we had only dropped our energy use by 5 quads. And even then, we were wasting even more than when we were using more. So we were wasting 57.7% of it. We take a look at just the electric part of this. You can see the sources of electricity coming in on the left. The red is nuclear at 8.4 quads. The light blue is natural gas at 7.5, and coal, you can see a big portion of this is 19 quads. And we waste 68% of that 39.5 quads that comes into the electric power plant. It only sends out 12.71
Question, Bob.
kVA.
So is that waste in the delivery in the sense that the transmission
No.
is inefficient, or is it the kind of waste?
This is just in
Okay,
the,
wait, let's repeat the question for record purposes. So the question is that waste in transmission of electricity and distribution, or is it a different kind of waste?
this is the generation waste. And whether you're using nuclear or coal or whatever, you're taking water and turning it into steam, high pressure, and then running a turbine. And that's about, somewhere in the order of 32% efficient.
So
Now when you transmit it, okay, you can lose anywhere from 6 to 8% more in transmission, depending on
And the
temperature
waste
and
goes
distance.
in the form of heat, which then gets thrown away in variety of ways, into rivers, into oceans, into the air, cooling towers, dispersing the heat. One of the things we'll circle around to is, well, why don't we use that heat for something valuable?
and the end-use waste that you described at the beginning is over and above
Over
that.
and above what you just see. This is just before it even arrives at your
Yeah.
refrigerator.
Thank you.
Question up here.
And related to that, how much of it is the difficulty of adjusting the supply to fluctuating demand, so that you're constantly producing more than is needed?
Okay, so the question is, how much of the waste comes from trying to deal with the fluctuation in demand, matching supply and demand, because the grid always has to be in balance?
Yeah, so then you have spinning reserves and a number of things, because electricity has to be delivered instantaneously. And so the industry has gotten quite sophisticated at seeing when loads are coming and ramping up. And then they have all different kinds of generation. So you have base load, which is nuclear, and coal. And in the case of nuclear, the price of electricity can actually go negative in the early morning, where the plant has to pay the grid to take their power because they can't ramp down, okay? At the other end of this spectrum, you have jet engines, which are used as peaking units and are designed to run on natural gas or propane, and they only run for 20 hours a year. But they come on when the price of a megawatt has gone from $40 to $70 a megawatt to $1,500 a megawatt sort of on a peak day in August or July. So 20 hours is all they need to make money on those peakers.
Okay, so let me, this is another good, so the electric grid, and this is, we won't get too deep into this, but because the grid has to always be, the physics of the grid means that it always has to be in balance. You can't have voltage differences and other things. So you do have to maintain basically a flat line production curve, which requires all these different plants to be turned on and off and on and off. When you hit peaks, New England peaks in the summer, air conditioning loads, lights, hot the summer days, and all sorts of jet engines and other kinds of peakers go on to meet the demand on those days. Dick and I have been messing around with one of my more favorite potential companies, and I've talked in an earlier class about this. What's the largest battery in America? The largest battery in America. What's a battery?
Energy storage.
Energy storage,
Pump storage.
okay? What's the largest installed battery in America?
Hoover Dam.
Say what? Hoover Dam? No?
Pump storage.
Hot water heaters.
Say again?
Water heaters. Hot water heaters in the basement of every home and building in America, full of 135-degree water that's kept at 135 degrees, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Now here's an interesting peaking idea that I keep waiting for somebody in one of these classes to pick up the business and run with it. So I hit a peak day in August. It's 95 degrees in Boston. Every air conditioning unit in the city is running flat out to keep the lights cool and the people in the buildings cool. And we're turning on peakers all over the place, and the peakers by definition are often some of the dirtiest plants we have, the most expensive plants we have. If I could get everybody in this room and everybody in eastern Massachusetts to allow me to put a switch on your water heater at 2:30 in the afternoon when you're not home and you don't need the water, and I turn your water heater and hundreds of thousands of other water heaters off, I send a peak capacity into the grid that is cost-free, pollution-free. It's hot water that simply cools down a little bit while we don't need the power plants to keep it hot. All I have to do is turn the element off for 20 minutes, and it's worth a fortune. But I need to put a switch on every one of your hot water heaters. Do we think about this in this country right now? No. You know, somebody had it, but yes, question.
Is it a little bit more complicated though, because you've got gas hot water heaters in a lot of places, not electric?
Yeah,
Right.
you do. But actually, the bulk of water heaters in this region are still electric. It turns out something like 2/3, and then gas is a third. But even if it's 50-50, it's still a lot of electric hot water heaters. I mean, the gas we could do something else with, and we could actually do something else with it in winter days when you have peaking gas problems. But that's a different matter. But you're right. The electricity is only part of the picture.
I think the point that I would take from what Doug's saying is we're moving into an age of very sophisticated controls. And we can do lots of very interesting things with energy. And there's some work going on at BU right now. You know, you've heard of Enernoc, which is a demand response company. Well, they have about a 30-minute to 45-minute lead time. There's some work going on at BU right now, which might have a 5-second lead time. And the value of power in this big grid where, you know, power's coming at you, or need for power is coming at you, to respond in those time frames would quadruple the value or more of the electricity you're saving if you could do it instantaneously. And if you think of some of the big buildings you have here at the university, we have lights and air conditioning and computers and this, that, and the other thing, you could actually run this within the building itself so that when a price, a peak demand price came down the line to you, or your demand, I have to explain demand. Do people understand how demand works? Probably not. Anyways, a demand is a ratchet. So if at any time during a month, your electric requirement goes up to X, okay? And that's quite a bit above your average requirement. You will be billed a demand charge for the rest of that month at that maximum amount. And if you're a big commercial entity, you maybe build that for a year to 18 months because the grid is saying, hey, we had to deliver a whole lot of electricity to you, so that meant we had to have spinning reserves, we had to be ready for this, and that costs us a lot of money, so we're going to charge you for it. So if the university had time of day pricing, and you got to this point in the summer where you were paying $1,500 a megawatt instead of 40, and you had this ability to instantaneously turn off all the things in your building that you really didn't need and keep all the things that you really did need going, then you would save a whole lot of money. But you can do this. We're moving to a point where we're going to be able to do this in a building by building basis to shave demand and peak. And because shaving peak demand is an interesting problem. Electricity sales are flat and going down right now, but peak demand is going up. So this is the worst possible case for the industry. They need to build a whole lot more generation to meet the peak demand that maybe only happens 2 or 3 days a year, but they're selling less electricity because overall demand's going down, and so they get paid with what's called a pass-through incentive. They get paid by the number of kilowatts that run through the wires. So if the number of kilowatts going through the wires is going down, but the peak demand is going up, they're in big trouble. You can't make money. So I want to keep going because I want to get to buildings pretty soon. So just looking at the transportation side of this, again, look at this, 75% of the energy that you put into your vehicle is lost as waste. And as Doug said, you know, you got the air conditioner on, you're running your Escalade, you park outside the grocery store, just phenomenal amount of waste in transportation. But I'm not going to talk about transportation because that's Doug's specialty. So I want to address another question that comes up quite often. Is the China question, you know. Why should we do anything in the United States? Because, you know, China in 2006 passed us, and they're putting out more CO2 than we are, and darn it all, us good old Americans don't have to do anything until everybody else does. Well, this is, on the left-hand side, you see 1990. In 1990, the Chinese were using about emitting about 2,300 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. Well, when we were emitting 5,100. And then, starting about 2002, their economy really took off. And yes, in 2006, they passed us somewhere around 5,800 million metric tons. But why did they pass us? Well, here's an interesting thing. There's a lot on this chart, but in 2006, China was 20.6%, see in the upper right-hand corner, of the total of the world's emissions, which was 29 gigatons, and the US was 20.2%. So, that was a big amount to pass us by, right? There's only one problem. 30% of China's exports were coming to the US. So if you take essentially our emissions, manufacturing emissions that we ship to China, so to speak, we're really the cause of it because we're buying that stuff. If you do that, then we're at 26.3% even in 2006, and China was somewhere around 18%, or even lower. And even today, we're at 25% of China's exports. So if you think about carbon dioxide emissions, you know, it's what we're inducing in other parts of the country that is really still our responsibility. So then let's take a look at emissions in 2010. This is 4 years later. Again, the numbers look like China's streaking ahead of us. On the left-hand side, almost 24% Chinese and 17% us. But then if you look at the past 260 years, from 1750 to 2010, we're about 27% and China's under 10%. So we have, in my opinion, an ethical and moral responsibility to do something about this because many of these emissions will actually stay in the atmosphere to up to 400 years. So when you have a net increase in the atmosphere of certain types of greenhouse gases, it lasts a long time. So let's take a look at the last 50 years from 1950 to 2000 and what was going on. So on the left-hand side, we're at the end of World War II, and we're putting out in each of these sectors about 200 to 300 metric tons of carbon. And everybody's going up until you hit about 1975 or 73 when we had the first oil embargo. And look what happened to industry. Industry got real smart real fast. And they went, whew, we got to do something about our energy use. And ever since then, their energy use has essentially been flat. And their productivity has continued to go up. Transportation has continued to go up, but not that fast. But look at buildings. Buildings are consuming more and more energy every year, and that continues to keep growing. So people often say, well, we just built a new building, so it must be energy efficient. When we do audits on campuses, many times the building that was finished 6 months ago is the most energy wasteful building on the whole campus. Yeah.
So can you speak just briefly to this LEED certification?
Yeah.
And if I'm destroying your
No.
flow.
One of the things that Jordan does is we are LEED consultants and we do a lot of LEED work. I think LEED has been helpful in getting people to think about.
Does everybody know what LEED is?
Oh, okay. Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And it was set up by a bunch of real estate moguls about 15 years ago, I think. And what was interesting about it is they were trying to do everything. They were trying to get sustainability and energy and da-da-da-da-da. We're really just interested in energy. I mean, it's fine that all of the products came within 500 miles of the building, but that's not as important as the energy. And we've been banging on this for 5 or 10 years, and now we're seeing LEED becoming much more focused on energy. Not as much as some other certification systems, and there's like 60 or 100 of them. But still, energy is really where we're going to have the greatest environmental impact. That good enough? Yeah. Okay, so where do we use energy in this country? The black numbers on top are the national numbers. So industry uses about 25% of that 100 quads, transportation 27%, and buildings about 48%. In northern New England and New Hampshire, where we don't have major manufacturing or heavy industry, we only use 9% of our energy in industry, a little more in transportation, because you can't get anywhere in New Hampshire without driving. But 59% of all the energy in the state is used in buildings. The curious thing is, of the 650,000 buildings we have in New Hampshire, 6.5% of those buildings are commercial and industrial, and they use 53% of that 59%. The other 610,000 residential buildings use 47%. So the reason we're focusing on commercial and industrial buildings is really whatever Gordon said, that's where the money is. And it's so much easier to do $1 million or $1.5 million retrofit of a 100,000 square foot commercial building than it is to do a $15,000 retrofit of 200 or 300 individual homes, all the different owners. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't do residential, because we should, but I'm saying if you want to start, let's start with commercial and industrial. So what's causing the problem? Northern New England is incredibly dependent on oil, and if we look at 1,000 gallons of each of these fuels, or the BTU equivalent of 1,000 gallons, heating oil will put out about 15 tons of carbon dioxide, and 1,000 gallons is about what the average house uses a year for heating in northern New England. Propane, you need about 23.5, so 12 tons of CO2. Natural gas, a little better, around 10 tons. But wood is 2 tons. So if we can move to a renewable source like wood, we're really making some progress. This just gives you an idea of how oil dependent New Hampshire is. In the commercial sector, 64% of our buildings are on oil, 52% of our industrial, and 81% of our residential. That means we're at tremendous risk to volatility in the price of oil. The other thing is that all of northern New England depends on Brent oil. And that's foreign oil, the world price of oil, which is generally about 20% higher than the domestic US oil, which is West Texas Intermediate. And we have no mechanism of getting WTI up into the Northeast. So we're going to be dependent on foreign oil for a long time. As of this morning, Brent was selling for $117 a barrel. Here's the price of Brent over the last 10 years, 13 years. And you can see up to 2008, remember we were at $147 a barrel. We're getting awful close to that again, and we're going to continue to go up there. If anything happens in the Middle East, if the Iranians get really annoyed with us and drop a tanker in the Straits of Hormuz, 20% of the world's supply of oil could be stopped overnight. Yeah.
Why is wood so good? Are you going to get to that?
Yeah, I mean, why are the emissions so good? Well,
Yeah.
in 25 words or less, think about it this way. Wood took carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere sometime in the last 30 or 40 years. And when we burn it, we're putting that carbon dioxide back in. So if you look at the total equation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the last 50 years, that's essentially a zero contribution. Took it out, put it back in. And it's a continuous process. So, the trees are still growing as we're burning what's going on. If you look at coal or oil or natural gas, that carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere somewhere between 400 and 800 million years ago. So when you burn that, it's truly additive. And it is increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide throughout the world. Now when I showed you the numbers for 2006, remember I said it was 29 gigatons? 2011 it was 31.6 gigatons. And there was a letter from Technology Review from MIT to Obama that sent out in January that said it's well understood that sort of 32.3 or 4 gigatons is the maximum we can go to if we want to keep climate change under the 2 degrees centigrade rise. So we're right up against that ceiling. If we go by that, then we're in deep trouble. We're starting looking at 10 or 12 degrees overall increase in the world temperature, and that is not a scenario we want to go to.
But I've heard that you have to be careful about that, this biofuel thing, because it actually, it takes 30 years to grow a tree, and we're dealing with carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere right now.
Right. And there was the Man-Met study that came out related to Massachusetts, and we could spend 2 hours on that. But I am not a fan of that study because they started from today, and they didn't look at essentially the life expectancy of the world's total CO2.
Another question in the back. Could I see the hand up?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. So, right now, the coal power plant in the United States are being,
Cut back.
they die, they got closed.
Right.
Because of the emissions and everything. So, if people want to replace these power plants, do they want to go with gas? What about electric?
Well,
Okay, so the question is whether we're replacing coal-fired power plants primarily with natural gas at the moment. And the question about that is what?
Why don't we go electric?
well, what do you mean go electric?
The power plants are electric. They produce the electricity. The coal produces electricity in an electric generation station. And gas is the substitute fuel to produce electricity.
Okay, so they're feeding feeding gas into the electric.
into the same power plants, often take the old boilers out and put the new boilers in, and they run
But
natural gas.
my utility is National Grid,
Yep.
and National Grid takes everything. They take renewable energy, gas.
Yes.
Right. But the percentage of renewable,
When I use National Grid as a utility,
yeah,
a very small part of the energy feeding into that National Grid is renewable.
correct,
Very small.
very small.
Yeah, so the question or the comment for the record here is that depending on the utility company you are a customer of, they will have a mix of generation sources: nuclear, coal, gas, oil, renewable, wind, whatever. And based on that particular utility, that mix will be a blended combination of all that. For years in this region, it was dominated by coal. It's now somewhat dominated by natural gas, and natural gas is pretty rapidly destroying the coal plants because it's cheaper, it's cleaner, for a variety of reasons. It's a better fuel, but it is still a fossil fuel, and it still has major carbon emissions.
So I'm going to keep plugging away here because I haven't even gotten to buildings yet. So if we look at buildings, as I showed you in one graph, about 48% of all energy in the country is used in buildings. That's electric and thermal. So we have about 120 million buildings in the country serving 309 million people. If you look at the city of Nashua, which is 40,000 buildings and 85,000 people, 68% of the energy is in buildings. And if you look at New York City with 950,000 buildings for 8 million people, 79% of all the energy in New York City is used in buildings. So that's why we focus on buildings. If we look ahead for the next 30 years, we've got about 300 billion square feet of building stock right now. We're going to tear down about 52 billion of that. We're going to remodel 150 billion of that, and we're going to build new another 150 billion. So we have an opportunity over the next 30 years, if we pay attention, to have an impact on more than 75% of all the buildings in the country. And this graph is, I believe, just related to electric generation, but this comes to the principle of my talk, which is if you look at all the renewables, concentrating solar power, photovoltaics, wind, biofuels, biomass, geothermal, and you add them all together, you have the potential there of reducing carbon emissions by about 523 million metric tons a year. Energy efficiency will give you 688. New sources of supply cost on the electric side anywhere from 8 or 9 cents up to 15 to 60 cents if you're looking at photovoltaics. New sources of energy efficiency, i.e. reducing demand, cost about 1.5 to 2 cents a kilowatt reduction. So efficiency is really a great way to go. So I'm just going to run through some states. Here's New Hampshire, a little small state. We only have 1.3 million people. We use 417 trillion BTUs, and we waste about 65% of it. Come down to Massachusetts, which is about 3 times the size of New Hampshire in top population. You're still wasting about 60.5% with 5 times as many people. Then you go to New Jersey, which you sort of think of as the big industrial state. They're wasting 60%. And then you go to New York State, which is again many times bigger than New Hampshire and about 3 times bigger than Massachusetts. We're looking at 60% is being wasted, and a great deal of that is in buildings. So how much energy do we waste in general? About 75% of all our transportation energy, and about 68% of all our electric energy, even before it gets to us. And then, what none of those graphs show is that the energy that does get to us, we're probably, from our experience, wasting about 50 to 70% of the energy that actually arrives at our door. So, here's a question. What's the cheapest energy available?
Energy not used.
Correct. Go to the head of the class. The energy you don't use. Wood thrower has a number of wonderful characteristics. It's always available. The energy you don't use is always available. It never varies in price. It doesn't cost anything. And it has no global warming impact. So, very good. So now we're going to get into building science. And there's 4 things you got to remember about building science to really understand what's happening in the building. They're pretty basic. Hot moves to cold, second law of thermodynamics, through conduction, convection, and radiation. High pressure moves to low pressure. High moisture will go to low moisture, i.e. a wet, moist environment will tend to move towards a dry environment. And capillary action. Does anybody know what the tallest trees in the world are? How tall are the tallest trees in the world? Yeah, about how tall are they?
300 feet.
What?
300 feet.
400. 400 feet. Do you know why sequoias are 400 feet tall?
And not 500?
Not 500 or 600 or 700? Correct.
Answer was what? Say the answer again for the
The
record.
answer was capillary action. The pore size in wood is large enough that capillary action will only take water to 400 feet before the weight of the water overpowers the capillary action. Now, there's something called rising damp, which is how high water will rise in bricks. And if you run around town here and you look, you'll see kind of moss and all kinds of junk up to about here. The bricks will look different. They will have deteriorated more than further up. Well, the reason there is that the pore size in old bricks is very wide, and it really can't go much higher than that. Yeah?
What do the trees do when there is a limit of height?
They grow out, not up.
Right?
Yeah. But here's the trick question. In concrete, how high can water move in concrete? If you had a pillar of concrete, how tall would it be where capillary action would draw the water to the top of that column? A mile?
Top. To
What?
the top, whatever the top is.
Yeah, but what's the theoretical maximum? No? The pore size, remember, in concrete is much, much smaller than in wood. 10 miles, 16 kilometers. So when you're looking at concrete buildings, you really have to think about capillary action and how water moves. So here's our approach as the Jordan Institute. When we look at a building, we look at the whole building, or in your case and many other cases, the whole campus. How does this group of buildings work together? And the first thing you have to address is comfort. Because if you don't address comfort, no matter how elegant your solution for saving energy is, the tenants, the clients, the people we're living in are going to fight that a million different ways. And we have lots of neat pictures of somebody having a heating lamp on the thermostat to get the air conditioning to go up in the room. So comfort's really important. To get there, first thing to do is air sealing, insulate the envelope. That's much more. Air sealing is really important, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then separate heating from cooling from air exchange, improve efficiencies, and then begin to look at renewables. So here's a typical building, and this is what we call a stack effect. You have a typical house with a leaky attic. Hot air rises, heat does not rise. Hot air rises. And so as the air rises and goes out the roof, it reduces the pressure in the building and sucks cold air in down at the bottom. So you can see where the cold air can come into the building. If you stop that at the top, if you seal it off, then suddenly the only losses, you no longer have convective losses in the building, you have radiant losses in the building. And now the energy loss is relevant to the difference in the temperature outside and the difference in the inside. And you're getting convective losses, not convective losses. So here's a building we worked on recently. This is about 33,000 square feet. This is a picture taken about 1910, and this was a Veterans March from the Civil War. Here's the inside. It was a department store and a bank originally. Here's what it looks like today. Still a lot of nice ornate stuff. In the 50s, they did some screwy stuff down here on the front facade, which is unfortunate. And here's how we approach this. Air sealed envelope. And this is a technical term of art. Holes you can throw a cat through. Every building has them. And once we've gotten the holes closed up, then we look at the attic and to seal off the top so that hot air won't go through it. And then we seal off the basement where the cold air was coming in. So this is sort of a Trump boy. On the left is a picture of the same place before we started, and on the right is what we did afterwards. And if you see down in the middle there, that big box, that was wide open. There was 3 of them on that one side of the building, plus a bank vault. And think of heat as a lot like water in a ship. You know, you have your special J boat and it's 160 feet long, and you're sitting in the stern, and you say to your friend, geez, I got this 2-by-2 foot hole in the bow, but don't worry about it, everything's nice and tight back here in the stern. You know, your boat's gonna sink, okay? The same is true with heat in a building, okay? If you have a 1-inch hole around a door frame, that's a lot of inches. And heat doesn't say, oh, I'm just gonna try and get through this part of the wall. It's gonna go through the hole. So closing up the holes makes a huge difference. So we put in cement board. On the left here, there was no insulation. It was a 1/4-inch plywood. You know, that was essentially a hole. And there were a lot of them. We put 4 inches of insulation and cement board and air sealed that. That makes a huge difference in the air in the building. Here's another one. The before is on the right. That's all it had. And on the left, this was the finished product. Here's another big hole. This was a skylight. And in these old buildings, natural lighting was used a lot. So these guys thought, oh, we're putting a dryer in, let's just punch a hole through the skylight, which they did. And then we put a new skylight in. See, it's divided into 2 sides. And from inside, this was what it looks like on the inside, lighting the stairwell. And this is now, instead of R1, in other words, very low or high energy loss, it's somewhere around R5 or 10. It's a big improvement. Then we went up into the attic, and we took a contractor up there, and this is what the attic looked like. And he took one look at it and said, oh, that's no problem, I can clean that out for you, because we're going to foam the attic, but before you foam it, you have to get it really clean, okay, or the foam won't stick. He said, no problem, I'll get that out in about a day. We thought it was cellulose. Turns out it was mineral wool. The other thing we didn't know is, like almost all of these brick buildings throughout New England, at some point they had a fire in them. And if you look at this, you can see the white in the middle there. That's not a fault in the photograph, that's ice. Because the fire was in the middle of the winter, and when they sprayed water on the building, it froze. There's no trolley in this town anymore. Whoops, that won't work, this one. So we went upstairs, and see, here you can see the black soot on the left-hand side there, where the fire was. The bricks were so bad on the right that they actually replaced them with new bricks. So what we found was they had sandblasted this. They'd taken all the bricks that had been there and just thrown them on the floor, and all this grit was on the floor, and the bricks were on the floor, and it was all covered up. So it took this guy 3 weeks to get this stuff out of here. But he did a really nice job, and there's the finished, clean attic. And then we foamed it with about 2 inches of 2-pound isocyanurate. And the interesting thing about this, I can tell you more than you want to know about this, but see this little tiny line here? These old buildings were built, they didn't have air conditioning then, so they put a gap there behind the brick and inside the wall. And then they had big ducts coming up. And if you go along the side of these old buildings, they have big open grates on them. And in the summer, what happened was the cold air was sucked in at the floor and came up, particularly on the south wall, and took all the heat that had built up in the bricks. from the southern exposure and took it outside, and that was one of the ways they kept the buildings cool. It also kept them cool in the winter.
Would you agree that in the Victorian era, that the integrity of the building as it was originally built was probably better than what a modern building in the 60s was?
I agree with you in a lot of ways. These masonry buildings were very tight. They really knew what they were doing, and they took their time
Cross
building.
ventilation. They knew about cross ventilation. They knew so many things that we lost over the decades.
Right. But you have to remember that energy was really cheap. So it didn't matter that this was circulating cold air all winter, because, even when I was a kid, oil was 19 cents a gallon, and so we didn't worry about the price of energy. And so that's why these buildings work so well. And these uninsulated masonry buildings in the summer, if the brick got moist, dried to the outside, and in the winter, they dried to the inside. Now, you can really screw up a masonry building if you put an impermeable barrier on both sides of that wall. Because water's going to get to it. No matter what you do, water's going to get to it, and then you get into all kinds of problems. So if you insulate on the inside, suddenly you've cooled the brick so much that maybe now it'll start to freeze. So the best way to handle a masonry building, which I'll show you in a minute, is to insulate it from the outside. But that's hard to do on historical buildings. Somebody else had a question? Yeah? No? Okay, keep going. Then we put in about 18 to 20 inches of cellulose. So now we had about R60 to R100 on the top of this building. Then we went down in the basement, and what a disaster we found over there. This was the bank moved in, and this was an old exit cellar door, and they just filled it in with rubble, and the door was breaking down, and just a little bit of asbestos in here, like a lot. Cost us $84,000 to get rid of the asbestos. When we were done, see, all the asbestos is gone. We closed in that door, foamed it. Then we foamed the band joists where the wood hits the surface of the foundation. That's very common, and placed the leak. And then we went 2 feet below grade, so we were below the freezing point.
First of all, I owe you an apology because your whole thesis is efficiency is better than worrying about clean energy and all that. I owe you an apology.
No.
Second, I want to ask about this foam. Why did you decide foam?
Right. Good question. The question was, why did we use foam in this situation rather than some other form of sealing the basement? Isocyanurate foam is really great stuff because it's sticky as all get out and will stick to anything. This was a rubble basement that was built out of big blocks of granite, you can see on here. And the Historical Society came to us and said, would you please not use foam, we just assumed you'd use oakum. And I said, oakum? Do you know how oakum works? Oh yeah, I just put it in the wedges and it keeps everything fine. I said, no, that works on a ship, a wooden-built ship, because it gets wet and then it expands, and that is what causes it to make the hull tight. This is not a situation where we want it to be constantly wet. It won't work. So we negotiated with them. We put in that skylight that was traditional design as the historical. We saved a couple of interior stairways, and we did a bunch of other things, so we kind of negotiated with them. But foam is just a fabulous way of sealing a very uneven surface. If you had a block wall, which you could see later, you could use other things like rigid sheets of foam and overlap it and stuff. But in this application, foam was really slick. So the next thing you have to look at is the heating and distribution system. And this building was on steam and had one thermostat for the whole building. So the thermostat was on the second floor, so the people on the second floor were quite comfortable in the winter. The commercial spaces on the first floor were 40 degrees, and it was hard to keep tenants. And the residential folks on the third floor, and the windows open all winter. And so, one of the things we wanted to do was replace the distribution system because the distribution system was steam, okay? So we had to switch from steam to hot water. And the reason for this, from an energy standpoint, is this. Once you tighten up the shell, okay, so you're not leaking a lot anymore, you want to get energy to the system as cheaply as possible. And there's few BTUs. Well, if you take water from the city streets at 50 degrees and you heat it up to about 130 degrees, that's going to cost you about 500 BTUs per pound of water. If you then take it from 130 degrees, you can easily heat a building if you do it right with 130 degrees. If you take it from 130 to 212 degrees, okay, water, that's another 15. Whoops, I'm sorry. This is so exciting, I just lost my... Anyway, if you take it from 130 degrees up to 212, but it's still water, okay, that's another 800 BTUs to get to 212. To take it and make the phase transition from 212 water to 212 steam, guess a guess, how much energy does that take? Just take a guess.
1,400.
1,400? Do I hear? Hear any more? You on?
It's more?
It's more?
2,000.
It's more? Come on. Do I hear a bid for more than 2,000?
10,000.
3,000. 4, 5, 7, 8. 8,100 BTUs to take a pound of 212 degree water to 212 degree steam. So if you have a steam system, you'll want to get off it, all right? And one of the things that's kind of confusing to people is they get all consumed with the efficiency of their boiler, okay? If you don't have a steam boiler and you just have a hot water boiler, the efficiency differences are a couple degrees. 10%. You go from a 70% efficient old atmospheric gas boiler, and you go to a super duper condensing boiler that gives you 91% efficiency. And okay, you save 20%. 2/3 or more of the waste in your system is in the distribution system. Okay? So you really ought to look at the distribution system. And I'll tell you why. Oops. Just a couple other things. The other things we did is we put in 40 thermostats. That gave us a lot more control than one. We put in high efficiency pumps with variable frequency drives, which I'll show you. We right-sized the boilers. There isn't a building in New England in which the boiler is not oversized. Boiler guys, if the guy who's selling you the boiler is also selling you the fuel, watch out, okay? You're playing against the deal. Yeah.
I don't understand why it should be bad that it takes a lot of BTUs to heat up steam. That just means you don't need that much steam to heat your room.
Right on. But if you can do it, if you can heat the room just as efficiently with a tenth of the energy, in other words, go with 130 degrees, what's the difference? Okay? You can put in a little short, I'll show you one. Then we'll come. Well, just hang on. Okay. Here's a typical steam radiator. Okay. The one on the left is maybe 18 inches long, and the one on the right is maybe 2 feet long. Okay. If I can do the same thing, and I need 212 degree steam to go into this, and then I need to get the condensate back to the system to reheat it again, blah blah blah. If I can do the same thing with 100 degree water, but I extend the radiator so that it's now, let's say, 100 feet long instead of 18 inches, I can heat the room, get the same number of BTUs into the room with a much lower temperature of water. So what does a 120-foot long radiator look like? Whoops. That's not the touchscreen. This is the touchscreen. Okay. There's a simple fin tube. This is the fancy one. Okay. This is a Buderus. What? This is a Buderus radiator. Has a little- What?
Feedback. Put it on your tie, if you move it down.
Okay, can we turn that on?
If that, no, maybe that's the problem.
Okay. This is high physics here. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
But
Do you have to repipe the whole
yes.
building to switch from steam
From
to
steam and hot water, you have to repipe the building.
That's expensive.
It is indeed. In this building, we spent about $128,000 putting in a renewable source boiler, and we spent $350,000 repiping it and putting in hot water. However, the annual cost of fuel went from $65,000 a year to $8,000 a year. So the payback on this project was under 10 years. So let me just go back quickly to show you how bad things were when we started. Okay, this was an oil-fired system that was generating steam. It was a mess. And you see over on the left, those are 3 different oil-fired hot water tanks. We had, I think we had 33 apartments, or 40 apartments that were being served by this. Spaghetti, just miserably installed. There's a condensate tank that was always overflowing and water all over the floor. These were the old boilers, old radiators. There's the new ones. Here's the new system. These boilers weren't very old, so we just switched them from steam to hot water, which cost about $1,500 a boiler. And on the right is the renewable energy. We put in variable speed pumps, and now remember I was telling you about controls and how sophisticated they're getting? Well, with a variable speed drive pump, you have an outside, what's called an outside reset. It measures the outside temperature and the desired inside temperature. It calculates how much water is needed in each of these radiators that we were talking about, and it raises or lowers the temperature of the water and the speed of the circulation based on the known size of the distribution system. And when you do this, you can drop your energy use dramatically because you're dealing with all 3 of those variables, where before you just said, give me 212 steam and I hope the room heats up. Also, by insulating the attic and the basement, we dropped the load, the heating load in the building, almost 50%. So now we needed a much smaller system. We put in simple controls. Please put in simple controls. There's a whole lot of proprietary controls out there that'll sell you for an arm and a leg. I won't name names, but the only way you can get an answer is to call Texas, and they charge you $100 an hour to talk to them, and it's a nightmare. These are very nice Techmar controls out of Canada. Anybody can understand them. They're very sophisticated. If you have any problem, you just call Techmar and they walk you through it. But keep the controls as simple as possible.
I actually have to inject something here. We did a lot of work in New York City, and companies that go in and fix buildings always put in control systems. Typically, they put in their own control systems. We won't name names, but there are many companies out there that have their own proprietary controls, and they'll promise that the building will now be 20% or 30% more efficient, and the controls will manage the building better. They train the resident building sup or janitor to run the controls. That person leaves sometime within the next 6 months to a year and a half. The next person in the door has no clue how to run the control systems. Mrs. Smith calls up from apartment 2E and says, my apartment's way too hot, and the controls are overridden and they go to manual, and essentially never use the controls again until the same control company and energy company comes back 5 years later and says, you know, we can get your building 20% more efficient. You get the picture. They train the next janitor, the building gets 20% more efficient, and they start the cycle all over again. And Dick's point about simplicity is incredibly important. And one of the key elements in energy efficiency is indeed simplicity and the ability to operate these buildings over the long term with people that actually don't have to go learn rocket science to actually do it. And that is a critical element that's been missing. Yes?
What do the control systems do?
Well, remember I was saying how there's what's called sequence of operation. Okay, so if you looked in the next slide, hold on a second. Here's the pellet-driven wood-fired system with a thermal storage tank and back. So now, and then we go to the next slide, and come on, go to the next slide. There's the outside storage tank for the pellets, 32 tons, and these three white tanks in the front are the solar. We have a solar thermal collector on this building. So look at this system here. We have a solar thermal collector to do the domestic hot water. We then have a wood system to back up the solar system. And then we have an oil system to back up the wood system. Okay? Now the sequence of operation here is very important, okay? Because if you have only one storage tank, okay, and you say, oh, my solar thermal collectors are going to heat up that storage tank. And it heats it up to, let's say, 100 degrees, but you want 120 degrees in your domestic hot water. Bingo! The wood boiler comes on, heats it the rest of the way up. Now the sun comes out from behind a cloud, and the sensors say, where am I going to put this heat? You know? If I have heated a tank up inadvertently with a backup system to say 160 degrees, and my solar collector can only put out 140 degrees, second law of thermodynamics says I'm out of luck. And so the sequence of operation is very, very important. And you can do the same thing with how many apartments are calling for heat. How much should we raise the circulation temperature? How fast should we circulate the water through the system? At what point do we call for the oil boiler? In this example, I'll give you an example of how things can screw up. We put this whole system together, we're pleased as punch with it. We thought the solar thermal collector would do all the domestic hot water for the summer. And at the end of the summer, we burned 8 tons of pellets. And we pulled this up on a remote sensor thing. We said, what the heck is going on here? The solar collector is not that undersized. And we went in, and what we found was there was a switch, an unlabeled switch, where up was automatic and down was manual. So it was the switch that controlled the access to the oil boilers. Those two on the left there. Well, the maintenance guy says up is on and down is off, right? So he comes in and flips the switch off, because it's the summer. I don't want my oil boilers on. What that did was the backup pellet system saw the water circulating through the system was dropping in temperature, so it kicked in to back up the solar system, and then the water came back and circulated through these two oil boilers. So the sections of oil boilers were all being heated up by the backup, the not backup wood system, and all that heat was going up the stack. So from that one little unlabeled switch, the sequence of operation was totally screwed up, and we didn't catch it until the fall. So it cost
Let me give you another example. The question of what do building energy systems manage, or what can they manage? If you take a skyscraper in downtown Boston with south and north facing walls, in the summer or the winter, the south side will be hot, the rooms in that side will be hot, the north side will be cooler, rooms will be cooler. Most of those buildings for years did not have the capacity to move the hot air from the south side to the north side. Nothing could be simpler, but you need a system that actually understands, well, the north side's really warm right now, the south side's cool, let's move that air around, circulate it around, let's heat the north side with the south side air. Systems like this will do that, and they will gauge the temperature differentials and move it around in buildings. But it requires intelligence, and it requires circulation and distribution systems that allow that to happen.
And there's a really good business out there for all of you students in what we're calling continuous commissioning, We've got these really good electronics that can pick up all kinds of data, masses of data from these buildings. You can put alarms in that say, uh-oh, something's not right here, and you can remotely access that. And there are businesses developing now for really big buildings that do this all the time, but they're very expensive. But doing it for these medium-sized and small buildings is something that could be done. So you get sophisticated. One of my staff went into a building the other day that had 4 energy recovery ventilation systems. And he was up in the attic looking at them and saying, 2 of these aren't running. So he goes downstairs and talks to the maintenance guy and says, what do you think, what's going on with those 2 ERVs upstairs? He says, it says right here on the controls panel that they're giving a warning. He says, yeah, they've been giving a warning for months, but they're all working. He said, really? Okay. So he goes up and looks at them, they're not working. So, the system was telling you they weren't working, but the local guy was saying, yeah, they're working, because he didn't know how they worked. This gets really ridiculous when we were working with one client who was a museum, and they called us up and they said, we have 2 energy recovery ventilation systems in our museum, one in the attic, one in the basement, and several people have come in and said, they don't really think they're working very well, and could you come look at them? We said, oh yeah, we'll come look at them. So we got our staff and we brought in our really hotshot engineer from Maine, and we all drove down there, and my staffer called up and said, Dick, we didn't need an engineer. I said, really, why's that? He says, well, in both cases, the ERV, the distance between the duct opening on the ERV and the actual duct was 4 feet on both sides of these machines. Neither of them had ever been even connected. And then when we looked even more carefully, they hadn't even been wired. Okay? And on top of that, the design of this thing, which was 10 years old, was completely backwards. I mean, the actual machine itself was flawed. But the installer had a service contract, and he'd been coming in every 6 months for the last 10 years, changing the remarkably clean filter. So I've said to people, this is criminal. Oh no, Dick, that's just par for the course. Caveat emptor. You know more about your car than you know about the building you're in.
Joe, question for
Yeah,
Joe, and then Dick,
you
you gotta
may-
get to.
You may be getting to this, but these are very good examples of building by building. How do you take this to scale, and
Right.
kind of what are the best practices and what cities can do to make this happen in all of their
Okay.
buildings?
Let me just zip through this one because I love this building and I can't not show it to you. Anyways, this is northern New Hampshire. Boston has about 3,500 to 4,000 heating degree days. This part of New Hampshire has 9,600 heating degree days. It was a pharmaceutical company that needed to keep the temperature inside the building between 62 and 68, or their supplies and their finished product was going to go to be destroyed. This building was 35,000 square feet, had a block wall, no insulation, none. An R value of 1.8, which is very low. 1 is the equivalent of a single pane of glass. We foamed it from the outside, foamed the leaks from the inside. This is very typical in warehouses where you can actually see daylight between the top of the wall. Whoops, sorry about that. Between the top of the wall and the ceiling. And when it's minus 40 out, that's a big hole, okay? And then we put siding on the outside, and we put in a energy recovery ventilator, and this takes exhaust air that heats up the incoming new supply air and saves about 85% of the energy in the exhaust air. You can cut your heating bills by about 10 or 15% just by using energy recovery ventilation and heat recovery. And then we put in a biomass system outside. We took this, we reduced the demand in this building by over 50%, and by switching from oil to wood, we reduced the cost of fuel by another 60%. And so the net was this owner was paying $65,000 to $70,000 a year just to heat the building with a 2.3 million BTU oil boiler. We replaced it with 290,000 pellet boilers and they never ran at the same time. So we had essentially a 90% reduction. And his costs went from about $65,000 to $8,000 a year. Again, it pays off quickly. So now I'm going to show you something else. Now I'm going to get into answering Joan's question.